Okay, so this is a tough question, but what could these ancient sedentary hunters and gatherers do with these ancient Natufians once they face this crisis? Where, let's say this is showing you a wild strand of wheat in that part of the Middle East. What if there's less of it? What could they do? Well, some of you might have thought that some of these people could become mobile again, and that's what some of them did. But some of them chose not to be mobile, to stay sedentary in one village. And what they started to do was to cultivate the plants, the wild plants. What that means is to help those plants grow. So maybe they notice that the wheat grows in certain areas, but in some areas it doesn't, but it potentially could grow there. So maybe the ancient Natufians started to plant more wheat themselves, to be active rather than passive. Rather than just wait for the wild wheat to appear, they started to actually plant the seeds themselves so that they could increase the amount of wheat. Maybe they started to bring more water to some of these plants. Well, as they started to do this, as they started to be more active in planting the seeds, when they collected the seeds of the wheat and the barley, they probably would have noticed differences in the kinds of seeds, right? For example, some seeds might have been slightly bigger, and they might have said to themselves, let's plant the bigger seeds next year. Let's take some of the bigger seeds and make sure to plant them for the next harvest. And you'd have a harvest year after year. And every year, as they're sifting through the kernels of wheat, they might decide, let's pick the best. Let's pick the biggest seeds, and we'll keep those and we'll plant those for the next harvest. Right? So we're essentially selecting for the best traits. Year after year after year after year, they selected the wheat that had the largest seeds, as we're going to see also other characteristics that served people the best. And after hundreds of years, what they ended up doing was producing domesticated plants, right? And it's at this point, once these Natufians domesticated plants, we are now in the Neolithic, right? So the end result of that process of selection by those Natufian people resulted in domesticated plants. And as I said before, archaeologists are not very good when it comes to naming things. So how do archaeologists figure out to make sense of the Neolithic? Well, what they did is they said, during this early Neolithic, you don't have pottery. Later Neolithic, you have pottery. So we'll call this the pre-pottery Neolithic. It's a big period, though. And you have the appearance first of plants, and then later you have the appearance of domesticated animals. So let's divide it into two, A and B. Right? So this first period is called the pre-pottery Neolithic A, or it's usually written PPNA. Right? This is when you have domesticated plants. During that time, they're experimenting with animals. And by 7,500 BC, there's evidence of domesticated animals, right? So you see, it's kind of a stepwise process here. That what happened, that the climate change allowed Natufians to settle down, to become sedentary, right? The climate then got a little worse. People had to be active. They started selecting for traits of the plants, right? By the end of the Natufian, beginning of the Neolithic, they have domesticated these plants. Then they start experimenting with animals, and they have domesticated animals. Right? Okay, now this is kind of the simplified version. There's debate about timing of certain things, but for our purposes, this is a good version of trying to understand what happened in the Middle East. Right? So once you had agriculture, once you had domesticated plants, and then later on you had domesticated animals, what do you think happened to the population? If you thought that there'd be an increase, you're absolutely right. There would be, because you are now producing food, growing food. Right? So in the Natufian, you'd have maybe 18 people, maybe more. There'd be communal areas. They would live in these round houses, as you could see. And then once they had domesticated plants, now you'd have villages of 90 people. They might have these communal food storage areas like granaries. That would be, they'd kind of have a floor that was up off of the ground so the grain wouldn't spoil. People would still be sharing, right? There were, 90 people. Then when you throw animals into the mix, now you're producing a lot more food. You have domesticated plants, you have domesticated animals, you have much bigger villages, 900 people, let's say, in a big village where people are making houses out of mud brick, like you can see here. And one of the trends that we see from the PPNA to the PPNB is not just the addition of domesticated animals, but also there's a change in the architecture, as you saw. Right? From the A to B, there's a change from round houses to square houses. Right? And you can actually see this at archaeological sites. Here's the earlier layers where you have round houses, and later on you have square houses at the same site. Why is that? Well, people probably realized there were advantages as the village got bigger, as there were more people. There are advantages to having a square house. Right? Imagine, this is almost like HGTV in the Neolithic, right? What are some advantages of a square house versus a round house? As you could see, you can add an addition. You could expand, you could subdivide, you could have a second story, right? There are many advantages to a square house compared to a round house. You could have a little bit more of a structure to the village. It's easier to have more of straight streets running if you have square houses versus round houses. So it seems like people all over the Middle East realized this and switched from round houses to square houses. All right, let's look at that site again in Syria, where you saw a switch from round houses to square houses. This is a site called Abu Huraira. You can see it's right there in Syria. Right, we're going to look at this area of the Middle East. We've been looking at this area for a while. This is where the Natufians lived. Right, but what did they find Abu Huraira? This is pretty interesting, and it's especially interesting, I think, to some of you who are in the health-related fields. What they found is that the foot bones of especially the women in the communities, looking at the skeletons of the women in the communities during the Neolithic, they saw a lot of skeletal problems with the women, especially in the toe joints, right? So you can see these are part of the toe right here. There's scar tissue right there. In fact, there was so much scar tissue building up that the toes were fused in an upright position. There are problems with the knees, and there are problems with the vertebrae in the lower back. You can see that there's scar tissue that built up between the vertebrae because all of the cartilage got worn out. And it got worn out probably from all of the work that women had to do grinding grain. Right? You heard the daily grind. This is the daily grind. Hours and hours a day grinding this grain in order to turn it into food. In Central America, you can still, this is a picture from Central America, you can still see women do similar kinds of work with corn using what's known as a mano metate, very similar kind of tool. Right? So this, agriculture was very debilitating for people, not just in terms of their diet, but also in terms of the work that they had to do, right? This actually took a toll on people's skeletons, as we can see, right? Okay, let's look at another site in a sort of a nearby area down here, Jericho. You've all heard of Jericho from the Bible. Jericho goes all the way back to the Neolithic, well before the time period of the Bible. And it was a pretty large Neolithic site, and it gives us some interesting information about ancient religion. What they found at Jericho were plastered skulls. These were the actual skulls of people, where after they were buried and the flesh and the muscle tissue was gone from these people, some skulls of some individuals would be removed, plastered over, sort of facial features reconstructed, and then these skulls would be displayed in people's houses or buried underneath their houses. And this is showing a particular kind of worship, we believe. Right? So here you can see some of the actual skulls. There are also some masks. that were found. Masks typically in different communities represent spirits. These are different kinds of masks from Native American communities, right? So this is a Iroquois mask, a Siberian mask, Northwest Coast masks over here, Southwest Kachina mask, and an Inuit mask. When these masks are used in these cultures, they represent spirits, right? So that might be something else going on. You can see maybe a spirit, plastered skulls, right? At Ain Ghazal, and you're going to watch a video about Ain Ghazal because I think it does a really good job of showing you this site. But Ain Ghazal, they found not only plastered skulls, but they found plastered people, right? Different groups buried together, right? So these were not actual people, but these were models of people. Maybe some of them were 3 feet high, created out of the plaster. Some of them were buried together underneath houses. So you put all of that together, and what is going on here? Many people think that this is a religion that is focused on ancestor worship, right? They're taking certain important people, plastering their skulls. They are worshipped. Those ancestors are worshipped. Depictions of ancestors are worshipped, right? A little bit like we see ancestor veneration or worship in parts of Asia today, right? So this part of the Middle East, their religion during the Neolithic was probably focused on ancestor worship or ancestor veneration. Okay, take a look at the next video, which is about Ain Ghazal. And once you watch that, we will then continue with a discussion of how do you recognize domestication? How would you know if you saw remains of a plant or the bones of an animal that it was domesticated? And we will come back.